Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's test automation webinar focused on achieving shorter release cycles for medical devices. I am absolutely delighted to introduce our workshop facilitator today, Paul Massey, who's the founder and director at Bluefruit Software. Paul has over 27 years of experience working with embedded systems, and he and his team at Bluefruit have worked on a number of software development projects over the years with various medtech partners. I know we've had lots of interest for today's topic, so without further ado, I would like to hand over to Paul.
Hello, thanks Sabrina. Hi everyone. It's a bit weird talking to a screen rather than a room full of people, but I'll assume you're all out there. So my name's Paul Massey. I'm talking today about how to achieve shorter release cycles for medical devices. Before we get started, it'd be really great just to have a first exercise of our polling tool here. And if everyone could just kind of click why they're here today and what they're hoping to get out of today. You should need to, I think you click one of those options and you click submit. Great, I'll just give you a few moments there. I was assured I was going to be able to see how many people have filled that in, but it's not giving me any feedback. Okay, let's just flick on. Great, so all of the above, great, that's good. So you've come to the right webinar. The none of the above might have suggested the wrong webinar. Great, and particular interest, it looks like, in automated testing. Great. Okay, so my name is Paul Massey. As Sabrina said, I'm founder and director of Bluefruit Software. I've got 27 years experience in embedded systems, 12 years doing formal Agile. I was sort of Agile with a small a before that, should we say, and 5 years doing medical devices. It's an interesting order because I've sort of brought embedded expertise to Agile and then Agile expertise to medical devices. And it feels like we've brought something a bit fresh to medical devices. Bluefruit Software is a company that I founded 20 years ago. We've now got 75 people co-located here down in Cornwall in England. Normally co-located in the same office, but strange times at the moment. We serve a range of sectors. About 60% of our work is now in medical devices, but we also do aerospace, automotive, scientific instrumentation, some industrial, a few other bits. The thing all of our customers have in common is they all care about quality and understand the value of investing in quality. So the way that we deliver that quality is through our Lean-Agile practices, and that will be a bit of a theme today. I'm aware over the years how different people have different definitions of Agile, so I always find it useful just to define what it means to us. And I like to define it in terms of these three layers. So principles, project management practices, and technical practices. So the top layer, principles, this is about adapting rather than predicting. And specifically, because at Bluefruit we're Lean Agile, what it means is we use the Lean principles. And they're there on the right. They're stolen from Mary and Tom Poppindick's Lean Software Development book. And we use those to help shape our practices, and they allow us to choose from an Agile toolkit on a sort of project-by-project basis with those principles guiding us. So the second layer down is the project management practices. This is sprints, points, user stories, etc. When we work with other businesses who describe themselves as Agile, often this is the area that they've really focused on. This is really important and delivers a lot of value. But what we also find is that this third layer is very, very important, in particular in terms of keeping the quality up, particularly in these sort of quality sectors. So if you're succeeding at the project management layer, then your requirements could be changing every 2 weeks. How do you keep the quality up? Well, that's to do with pair programming, mobbing, test-driven development, behavior-driven development, frequent or continuous integration, etc., etc. So that's what Agile means to us. A document that we really liked, especially as we kind of came new 5 years ago to medical devices, was TIR45. A lot of you probably are familiar with this document. It's a guidance document which helps, which kind of teaches Agile people about compliance, but teaches compliance people about Agile. There's a diagram here which helps map sort of 6304 activities to the Agile lifecycle. We've got a simplified version for today's talk, actually. This is a bit of kind of context setting for today. So TIR45 describes these layers: the project layer, release layer, iteration or sprint layer, and story layer. And it recommends that you map out which activities you're going to do at which layer. There's some flexibility there, but the key point is in your software development plan, you should really spell that out. Another key point that TIR45 makes is that although Agile sort of encourages us to do these activities as close to the story layer as possible, that's the most sort of Agile approach. What can happen is if some of these activities are considered done at the story layer, there's a risk of them becoming undone later by future sprints and stories. And so we have to make time to go back and check the doneness of these activities in sprints and releases. This is where we find a bit of tension can emerge. So doing the kind of testing, the release layer, going back and testing that can start taking a bit of time and can start bloating. And that's what we're going to be exploring a bit today. Also, just to narrow the scope of the talk today, with my lean hat on, we should be looking at the whole picture. A release cycle includes doing science, hardware design, software design, regulatory submission, approval, all that kind of stuff. But the scope of today is we're going to focus on the software part of that cycle. So, next poll. It would be really interesting just to understand for the audience today what your typical time is between formal software releases. So this could be to the marketplace or maybe for field trials or wherever you're kind of looking to get releases approved and formalized. What's the typical gap in time? Again, I can't quite see where how many people have submitted, so I'll just kind of give you guys 30 seconds. The promise, I think, in the sales pitch for the talk is that if, and what we often see with our customers is release cycles which take more than 12 months, 18, 24 months quite typically, and a good adoption of these Agile practices can really bring that down significantly, ideally below 3 months, but any shortening of that release cycle adds value. Let's see. Okay, really interesting. So majority sort of 6 to 12 months, and a good chunk more than 12 months. So as I said, wherever you are on that curve there, that bell curve we've kind of got there, investing in these activities that we talk about today will help bring those down and deliver benefits. So what benefits will you get from shorter release cycles? Well, there's many. Here's the big ones from our perspective. So first of all, quality. So this links back to the old adage around there's good, cheap, quick, pick two, or the sort of project management iron triangle, or any of these kind of project management sort of paradigms you might have heard of. But the basic point is with Agile, what we can do is we can fix the level of quality for every sprint and then look to vary the scope to deliver the schedule on target. So Agile gives us this toolkit to keep the quality fixed, and shorter release cycles supports that approach. Shorter release cycles also gives us more user feedback points. So that leads to greater improvements in user experience, because you get more feedback. The more frequent you get that feedback, the better the user experience, and the easier it is to select the best features that are going to add the most value to your end user as well. The next one's quite interesting, evolving business models. So a lot of the customers we work with a range from kind of lots of startups as well as big corporates. The startups often have ideas about what their business model is going to be, but we often recommend to test that in the market. So early releases, testing business models. So this could be, for example, if it's a medical device, is it going to be a subscription model, charging for assays, charging for instruments, whatever it's going to be? You might have ideas about that, but let's test it with the marketplace. And similarly for big corporates, we're seeing a lot of kind of pivoting around latest technologies coming out. And again, it allows us to kind of fail fast and get that market feedback about whether it's the right business model. And this is linked with, or similar with, funding cycles. So whether you're a startup and you've got rounds of funding and you need to achieve certain goals, we frequently see startups needing to demonstrate successful field trials or get to a revenue generating stage. Or in the corporates, we see sort of funding gates or rounds of funding that, again, need similar kind of goals. Shorter release cycles allow us to get there earlier, but also maybe iterate a bit. So it allows us to kind of get it wrong and iterate and go again. Again, really supporting more successful business as well as more successful projects. So just to explain a bit more about how that works, we've got some more diagrams here that we've kind of lifted from TIR45. There's actually 3 project life cycles, which we're going to go through, that are all in TIR45. They could all be described as agile, but maybe getting progressively more agile. So the first one is one that we frequently see in customers who have maybe got a waterfall background or are maybe working in a corporate environment, which is kind of still got a bit of a waterfall culture, and they're developing a product in an agile way. So there's a kind of big design up front around the requirements. There's a kind of roadmap of increments that are kind of coming out, but there's not a lot of flexibility. So if things have taken longer than expected, then milestones get kind of pushed back. Releasing at an early stage, at stage 2 or stage 10 or whatever it might be, is challenging because there might be a big monolithic user requirement document that can't be partially approved or formalized. And if the release cycle takes a long time, then it's difficult at a sort of drop of a hat to kind of decide to do a release. So this is where the second one, the one on the right here, comes in. In this life cycle, we're a bit more agile. So it looks like we've got a bit of a backlog here, and we're prioritizing user stories. So we're getting the highest value user stories in early, and we're maybe even evolving that or adjusting that backlog as we learn, as we go along. The requirements may be managed in a way that they can be a subset can be approved. And all importantly, the release cycle can be short, so it's easier for us as we start approaching into schedule or into budget. We can hit the button, do release, and take it to market or to field trial or whatever it might be. So here we're starting to see the benefit of shorter release cycle. And then finally, this is the kind of third one. This is the most agile of the 3, a sort of evolutionary life cycle. Here we're constantly creating releases. We can really create formal releases whenever we want, and this allows us to elicit more frequent and more customer feedback, and we can take any of these releases to market. So this is where we're really working for, but you really need all your agile toolkit, including really short release cycles. So that sort of explains about how and why short release cycles are important. So what's the barrier to them? So again, time for another poll. Please, you can tick multiple boxes here if you like, and hit submit. So there's all kinds of things that can slow us down. Sometimes it's bug fixing that can indicate quality issues, testing, documenting, requirements management. I've already highlighted can be a barrier. Maybe just coding the features is taking your team a long time, longer than expected. Okay, hopefully everyone's had to go at answering that. Okay, so requirements management, really common one. It's really interesting. And quite a mix there of bug fixing, testing and documentation. That's great. Definitely some people are seeing testing and documentation as a challenge. That's definitely an area that we've seen a lot at Bluefruit. Bug fixing, other things can help with, such as TDD, and really bring that one down. Definitely recommend that. That's for another talk. And requirements management, again, another talk. We do hope to do more webinars in the future, so we can go into those in more detail. So at Bluefruit, what we were finding was testing and documentation were a really common cause at this release layer. They could take quite a lot of time. And we're talking months sometimes on some projects because they would be so large, especially around the testing side of things. So what were the answers? Well, test automation and living documentation. I think that was kind of given. So these things can really help in these areas. At Bluefruit, we've adopted these practices pretty much as standard across our projects now. Whether it's medical device or not, we find they add a lot of value. And so if we were to help you on your projects, then you would see these in practice, but we can also help you adopt them yourself. So first up, test automation. I'm going to quickly go through what it is, what it looks like, how does it reduce the release cycle time, how to get started. We won't go too technical today. Again, any feedback, if we want more technical webinars, we can do those in the future, and we can share some of our experience about what the main challenges are. So test automation. What is it? Well, we take a load of testing ingredients. If your team's agile already, they're probably doing a lot of these things already. So we practice something called behavior-driven development, which means we have feature files. Whether we've been automating tests or not, we always have these kind of feature files. And these are often described as specification by example. Or the other thing BDD does, which is a neat trick, is it makes specs and tests into one artifact, so you don't have the problem about keeping them synchronized. It describes the specifications as test. So all of these ingredients may exist already. They get pulled in by a build server into your automation. They pull the right versions, matching versions of everything, and into the test framework and squirt it onto a target platform. And then there's a test rig to kind of stimulate that target platform. And that might be a robot camera, or it might be something a bit more software oriented, like Selenium or a kind of equivalent. And then out pops your test results, your coverage reports, traceability matrices, and if you're into executable specifications, your nicely populated executable specs. So that's what it is. What does it physically look like? Well, it's a whole mix of things. At Bluefruit, we've kind of built up this kind of toolkit. Again, we're open to kind of sharing these toolkits. So there may be a physical element to it, robot arm, which is pressing buttons, interacting with touchscreens, interacting with assays or connectors or whatever it may be. We might do custom electronics for interfacing with touchscreens or interfacing with inputs and outputs. The GUI automation, I've mentioned Selenium. If it's an embedded system, maybe using Qt. There's some great BDD frameworks like Squish and Funk. Also in our toolkit, we've started experimenting with AI very successfully, so that can assess results or outputs. Is pump running? Is result good? That kind of stuff, and categorize that like a human would, and OCR as well for checking text on screen. All of that. So all of that builds up into a toolkit which allows us to actually automate our testing. So how does it reduce the release cycle time? Well, what we see, coming back to this TIR45 diagram, what we see a typical project looking like is when we come to it is the unit testing might be automated, might be test last. And so we would be advocating test first, TDD style, but that's another talk. And then frequently we see manual integration system testing at story level, at the sprint level. And then maybe a bit of regression testing at the sprint level. So this is about checking that doneness I was talking about earlier, checking that we haven't broken something that's gone before. But often that will be partial because just at that time. And then at the release layer, there'll be more integration system testing and probably a full regression test. And we often see that taking anything from 2 to 12 weeks to do a full regression test, especially as we go to a more mature product. So when we get involved in more mature products, that regression testing can be really big, closer to that kind of 12-week time for a team. And the other thing that we see creeping in is variant testing. So on mature products where you bring out a kind of second release of hardware, we had a client who had long testing and then brought out version 2 of the hardware, but needed to continue supporting version 1. Well, that's a multiplier on the effort required to do a release. And it just starts getting really out of hand. The solution is very much automated testing. And so what does it look like now? Well, at the story level, we're now going to predominantly automated testing for our integration and system testing. At the sprint layer, again, we can now be doing full regression tests because we've got all that automation. And the manual testers are freed up to do stuff that humans add more value doing. So exploratory testing, usability testing. There may be still some manual testing, but what we aim for is a majority of automated testing. And then all importantly, at the release level, these large effort tasks of full regression tests and variant testing can all be automated. And again, humans adding value at the exploratory and usability testing. The regression testing, variant testing may still be the same effort, but you've got a computer doing it instead, right? So some tests might run a bit quicker when a computer's doing them. Some might still take the same amount of time, but they can be running 24 hours a day. You can have multiple build servers, as many as you like, running tests and running different variants of hardware, et cetera, et cetera. So we can really see where the benefit comes there. So how to get started? Well, we definitely recommend starting by, if your team's not doing BDD already, then start adopting that without automation. So just starting to capture your specs and tests in this gherkin format, given when then. There's an example there. Whether we're automating or not, we'll capture our tests that way, and that leaves the door open to automating later. And then you need to invest in infrastructure, build servers, etc. Give your team time to learn and create. Sorry, my light's going off there. Give your team time to learn and create processes, new processes around this stuff, and give them time to automate. And of course, if you're missing capabilities or just simply capacity, then Bluefruit are here to help. So typical client challenges that we see, aligning the tests and keeping the tests aligned with the requirements. There's no good testing the wrong thing. So again, BDD is the solution there. Managing traceability. An easy solution here is tagging and gherkin, and you can then use a bit of scripting or what have you to infer all the traceability matrices. Interfacing with UI components, I've already talked about, using BDD frameworks, and interfacing with low-level drivers or inputs and outputs. We've got a kind of raft of techniques that we can recommend in this area, whether it's around test doubles mocking or custom electronics, depending how far you want to go. So that's test automation and how that helps. So moving on then to living documentation. This one was a really high value find for us. So same format, I'm going to go through what it looks like, what it is, what it looks like, how it reduces the release cycle time, and how to get started. So similar pattern here. We've got a whole bunch of artifacts that if you've got a sort of high-performing Agile team already, these are probably all things that they're doing already, documents they're creating already, BDD feature files, TDD test intentions, etc. All those things there. And we can have a build server which pulls all those documents together, all these kind of engineering documents which are maybe not auditor friendly and maybe not compliance team friendly. They're buried away in Git in formats that maybe auditors aren't comfortable with, maybe on tools. So what you can do is set up your build server to pull all those together, get the right versions, collate them, format them, and output a nice auditor-friendly document, which can be a kind of wiki-style HTML format or a PDF type document that can go into your document management system. So what does it look like? Well, on the input side, we've got all these kind of engineering-y things that the software engineers love, that they're doing anyway. They keep them up to date because they're using them on a day-to-day basis. So they're highly valuable assets that they're doing anyway, but not very friendly for other members of the team. And we may even be keeping things like software development plans and markup and all this kind of thing. And then on the output, we get a nice formatted, branded, if we want, rich text kind of document. And what's great about this output document is you can get one of these for each and every build of your software. So they're really useful to the team, to the engineering team, and really valuable to the compliance team as well. So they're adding value all the time. So something that we keep coming back to at Bluefruit is we always feel that compliance should be adding value. I think that was the original intent, but all too often what we see is compliance as a sort of siloed activity, which is kind of bolt on, and so engineers don't sort of buy into that. So how does it help with the release cycle time? Well, this is the ideal project in TIR45. You've got all these activities, and they're probably all producing documentation. Documents are coming out, all of them at the kind of output part of their process. And in TIR45, it kind of looks like that's your living documentation is kind of there and happening. What we see in practice, in reality, is those documents aren't auditor friendly. So a compliance team working with engineers end up having to, as we go along, kind of compile those, which is a bit laborious. In real reality, in the real world, we often see that this gets delayed and doesn't happen as we go and becomes a big activity around the release time. And again, we get this kind of bloat. And so this combined with the kind of test automation, you can start seeing how release cycles can start taking months when you've got all that regression testing to do and you've got all this documentation to produce. It can take months and months to do this release. So living documentation, what it does is automate this step. So it takes all those engineering documents and constantly generates these automated documents, these automated living documents. In reality, at release time, there's maybe a bit of work still to do there for the compliance team to pull it together, but it's a much more manageable piece of work to do. So benefits, I think I might have mentioned these already. So for each and every build, you've got documentation that's contemporary to that build. That means your engineers see the value of it and they buy into it and they contribute to it rather than saying that's something somebody else has to pick up the pieces on. So how to get started? We really recommend starting by speaking to the engineering team and saying what documents are they wanting to create already? Which ones are they on? Which ones are they finding useful? So much of what's actually needed for compliance is actually being produced in some format or another already. Maybe it's just in a tool, Jira or something like that, or maybe it's in some text files in Git, and they might just need tweaking or they might be good as they are. But let's start there because that gives you that buy-in. invest in infrastructure as before. Use tools like Sphinx. Some of you might have heard of this. It's a Linux tool for kind of formatting all this document and bringing it together. And it's got a great quick start feature, which can get you up and running really quickly. And we really recommend doing that. So don't leave this late in the project, early in the project. Get a first spin of this, however incomplete it is, and get the compliance team feeding back about what's missing and kind of iterate as the project goes on. And that's where you get the most value. Again, if you're lacking capabilities or capacity in this area, speak to Bluefruit. Brief client story here. So one project we were working with a client where they were outsourcing to another team, and that documentation wasn't being done as we went along. What happened when it came to release time is all engineers had to down the tools for like 4 weeks, produce hundreds of pages of technical documentation, which is beautiful documentation, all technically accurate, but hard to write because you're not in the code at the time, and hard to review. And the most soul-destroying bit of it is within a few weeks, when they go back to the day job of engineering, it's gone out of date, so they don't refer to it anymore. Solution, living documentation. So to wrap up, if you think these benefits are going to add value to your business, which I think they should add value to any business really, quality, more user feedback, looking and experimenting with your business model and aligning with your funding cycles, then really measure yourself against this evolutionary life cycle. How close are you? What are the barriers to achieving that? And we found that test automation and living documentation really play a key role in getting there. So just a brief pitchy bit in terms of Bluefruit. If you're looking for help on any of this stuff, then we can provide training, workshops, support your in-house team. We can provide a team to set up automation testing for you and hand over to your team to maintain, or we can maintain it. We can, if you just want your product developed this way, we can do outsource software development or parachute in B&B teams to just help with that area. Loads of reading on this on our website, and we are looking at doing future webinars, maybe digging into the technical elements of these a bit more. Over to questions.
Paul, we have a couple of questions actually that I would like to put forward from the audience. The first question is, what portion of systems tests is it possible or typical to automate?
Well, we see this to vary quite a bit depending on the appetite for investing, but it's rare it would be 100%, but we typically strive for over 90%, 90, 95%. But even customers who've got legacy projects or are not sure about how much to invest in this, even just kind of automating 30, 40% of your tests can add a lot of value and get the stakeholders to buy in and invest more.
Okay, great. Another question that we have here from the audience is how much time does living documentation save on average?
Okay, that's interesting. So living documentation, roughly speaking, we find takes documentation down from what was weeks of activity on the engineering team down to days in the release cycle. And on testing and test automation, we've seen it taken down from months on regression testing down to weeks.
Lovely. Another question that's come up is, have you had any quality audits on these processes, and how have they gone?
Yeah, so as Bluefruit, as an outsourcing company, we're not actually regulated directly ourselves. Our customers are regulated. So we don't get audited by the regulators, but we do get audited by our customers. And usually they are sort of delighted, I think would be the word. So to see processes which the engineering team are actually engaged with are, the documents being authored by them, and just seeing that we've kind of thought about this and we're doing it for real, we get really positive feedback from our customers.
That's great to hear. Another question that's come up here is, how do you actually reassure customers that shorter release cycles will not introduce poor quality?
So that's a really good question. We start by agreeing a sort of a quality agreement with our customers. So that will discuss which quality activities we're going to be responsible for. And then we also, sometimes in that document, sometimes just engineer to engineers, we agree what sort of metrics to look at as well. So those, you have to be careful with metrics, but as long as the team aren't using them to kind of make decisions themselves, but they're just used for monitoring. So we'll be looking at simple code quality type metrics, as well as things like test coverage and bug tracking and all those kind of things. So really, I think that the key to that answer is agreeing good metrics, healthy metrics, making them clearly available. So we do reports at the end of every release, every sprint. Actually, we do a report to our customer, and any of the kind of quality metrics that they're interested in, we're including that document and comment on those. We also, that's a sort of numbers-based approach in terms of a sort of qualitative type approach as well, is if our customers have engineers on their team, we would welcome and encourage them to be involved in the code reviews as we go. With our Agile hats on, we're always keen to get early feedback. So if they're not happy with the quality, or even if it's just style type stuff in the code, then we'd like to know early, and the earliest point would be that they could be involved in those code reviews.
Okay, great. Another follow-up question actually that has come up here is, approximately how long does it take to introduce a living documentation or test automation, to an R&D?
That depends whether it's an existing project or a greenfield project. So greenfield project, we would often have a kind of ramp up period in the project where we're kind of setting up all the infrastructure, and we're maybe just not kind of running at full pace in terms of the requirements. There's maybe early kind of trials going on with usability testing and that kind of stuff, prototyping, and we use that time to get the infrastructure set up. But often it's kind of serviceable within 2 to 4 weeks on a greenfield project. On a legacy project, which is one that's running already, we just wouldn't rush it. So the living documentation and test automation can be eased in gradually. So if we're being involved in the software development, then we'll start using, or even just on the V&V, we'll start refactoring the test cases into a BDD style and start just running those manually, and then bit by bit over time. And so within a few months, we can start getting quite a sort of significant number of the tests, so that stakeholders can kind of see the value of it. Maybe within 3 months, the stakeholders would start seeing the value of that automation, test automation, and then we can kind of ramp it up from there. But we just wouldn't rush it, really. It would just pace it according to how the stakeholders are comfortable funding that.
Okay, great. As a follow-up question to that, someone else has also asked, what's the investment like to set up, automated testing and living documentation?
What's the investment? A bit similar to before, really. It depends what appetite there is. So often customers who have seen it work before, or who have got experience with seeing regression testing taking months, they can immediately see the value for it, and they invest heavily at the beginning. There's a kind of a choice. You can do it in-house, but if you're not familiar with it, it can be quite time-consuming. So again, outsourcing or involving people who've got experience and got the toolkit already can actually really help reduce the kind of cost of that investment. and keeping that to a kind of a minimum.
Okay, lovely. And Paul, someone else here has asked here that he said, I can understand that we can reduce development cycle and end up with a comprehensive documentation, but on their side, the time to register a certain SW version in some countries is becoming a bit of a limiting factor. Would you have any recommendations or tools to simplify the submission or review process?
I think that the main thing is just to be kind of well prepared. So if you've got high quality documents, high quality plans, and you can evidence all of those, so in that kind of first pass of the kind of auditors kind of looking at what you've got, they can see that it's all there, so they don't feel the need to do that full audit. Then that's going to be the kind of best tip at making sure that we avoid a real sort of drawn out audit. So living documentation really helps on that front, because it really demonstrates that these documents are kind of contemporary to the work being done, rather than kind of too often what we see is kind of customers coming to us who have maybe developed a product, maybe through no fault of their own, maybe they've developed it and it wasn't medical and they're bringing it across into medical. But I think that kind of raises eyebrows and really slows down the process.
A couple more questions, Paul. There's quite a lot of interest here. Sphinx looks like quite a developer-orientated tool. It looks quite techy. Is it possible to work with Office documents, which most of this person's colleagues is used to working with?
Yeah, so definitely you can pull together. So those source documents will be a whole range, and those can be Office documents, and you can bring all those together. Setting up the infrastructure on living documentation is a kind of techie activity, but if you can just get good processes around that, if you've got a mix of kind of techie documents, the kind of feature files, that kind of stuff, but let's say your software development plan is in a Word document, that will be fine. They can all be collated together, as long as you have a way of making sure the build server knows how to get the right version of those Word documents. So you need to make sure your version control has a kind of interface that you can hook into, but basically it can hook into anything and get converted and added in without a problem.
Okay, great. Another customer here has asked, look, it's great that customers can get a new version earlier, but what about the learning cycles? The user, mostly in the medical field, has to be very, very familiar with the machine and the software itself. Isn't it a contradiction to the short release cycle? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so there can be challenges, and in terms of getting that early feedback, sometimes it might just be around having focus groups. But in our experience, the kind of human factors side of medical devices, I mean, a lot of modern instruments that we're working on, there's a kind of policy that it might need to be used without training. And so you kind of want to see how the users interact with the product. So we, at Bluefruit, we've got kind of UX experts who've got a kind of range of techniques for basically putting an instrument in front of the customer, videoing them, not interfering, seeing how they get on, and recording those interactions and finding what they struggle with. If training is required or an instrument is required, then again, you should take the users through that experience that you're expecting, and then put the machine in front of them and see how they get on. And the earlier you find out things that they struggle with or get wrong, we work on an instrument, for example, that needs to be level, and the instructions and the training said keep it level. But early on in the process, you discover that users don't keep it level. And so we needed a software feature in order to address that challenge. So the earlier you know that, that's a hardware change required for that. So there isn't a contradiction there. There's this value of finding out failing early, and and actually, if you've got a good user experience, hopefully they don't need to be very, very familiar with the machine in order to use it successfully.
Well, thanks for that answer, Paul. Another question that's been posed here is how do you decide BDD test cases? Do these come from requirements documentation?
That's a great question. So it really depends on our starting point. So often, as I said, sometimes we're working in a corporate environment, which is maybe the corporation hasn't got an agile mindset more broadly, but the R&D team do. In those cases, there tends to be a kind of user needs document or a requirements document, which is a bit kind of waterfall, and that would be our starting point. And maybe the product spec will look like that. And then the BDD test cases will just effectively be the software requirement spec. At the other end of the spectrum, if it is a greenfield project, we might push the client to not have a user needs document and actually use the BDD documentation to cover all of the user needs, product needs, and software needs, and kind of start much earlier in the kind of V model, should we say? So it depends, but earlier the better. I think if I was to be pedantic in those situations where we're starting with the kind of user needs already laid out in the Word document or the product requirements, then I might describe that as acceptance tests driven development, or ATDD. That's BDD really is about using the agile feedback loop to discover the requirements. So if that document exists already, that's a bit of a barrier to the sort of full BDD process working, and I might just describe that as ATDD. Okay.
Okay, another question we've got here is, are there any commonly used test automation frameworks, script-based, that you would recommend?
That's a really good question. I think we'd need to get back to them on that question. That one's one that the engineering team would answer. But we tend to just use standard open source test automation frameworks. Sometimes we customize them a bit, or we have a missing step and we just use a bit of Python or something to plug those gaps. But yeah, happy to follow up on that question, actually.
Okay, lovely. We'll put you in touch with the person in question. I think that concludes all the questions that we've got here, Paul. I don't know if there's any closing remarks from your end.
No. Hopefully everyone's found it really useful and learned a bit. And as I said, any feedback about what perhaps more technical future webinars could be, we'd be happy to look at doing those and give a bit more detail on the technical side of things.
Perfect, that's great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar. As Paul said, I hope you found it very useful. And obviously, if there's any follow-up questions after this that you would like to direct to Paul and the Bluefruit team, then please do let us know and we will put you in touch with them. Many thanks for your time today and wishing you a great afternoon. Take care.